Hi everybody, I am Matthieu Genicot and I'm here to present work done in collaboration with Nicolet Trendafilov and Huang. So this work is about sparse principal component analysis, and more specifically sparse component analysis with weakly correlated components and nearly orthonormal loadings. So I'm going to explain this in a few minutes. So I try to make this talk as little technical as possible. So sorry for those who expect a more technical talk, but I would be glad to talk about more technical questions after. So first, why do we care about principal component analysis? So principal component analysis, or PCA, is a dimensionality reduction method. And so the goal is to find a new space, a lower dimensional space, by keeping as much variance in the data as possible. So for visualization purpose or to find some hidden patterns in the data. So it expresses the data in a new space. So where X are the data, A are called the loadings. And so basically, if you have this kind of data, you can see that there is a linear relation between the data. And this means that you can visualize your data in one-dimensional space by keeping most of the information, by expressing new variables, so the principal components, which are linear combination of the data. So in practice, normally you are in a much higher dimensional space, and so this is why PCA makes sense to visualize large data set, because you can, from a p-dimensional data set, going to a much smaller dimensional data set. And so the principal component, that is the new axis, are linear combination of all the p variables of X. And PCA also has the properties that the loadings are orthonormal, actually, and the components are uncorrelated. However, it has one obvious drawback if you are used to work with high-dimensional data set, is that the components are a linear combination of all the p variables. So in practice, you can easily apply PCA and visualize the results, but it's very difficult or even impossible to interpret the new variables, so the axis. So as an example, there are two common applications of PCA. So it is gene expression analysis and financial application. So in gene expression analysis, you usually deal with 20 or 25,000 of genes. So these are the dimension. This is the dimension of your space. And so when you apply PCA, your new axes are a combination of all these 20,000 genes. And it turns out that you can interpret the components. They can have sort of biological interpretation. So for instance, one component can be associated with age or something, and so the genes that are expressed together will be in this component. So when you have components that are linear combination of all the genes, it's really difficult to interpret. Also, in financial applications, you can use PCA. I know less about this one, but basically you can use PCA to analyze the market and help to make decision about which stocks you should buy or sell. And in this case, every non-zero loadings has a direct cost because there is a transaction cost. So for both this application, there will be an obvious advantage to have loadings that are not combined, that do not take all the p variables into account, but only a few of them. So you have to make a trade-off between the statistical fidelity, that is the variance explained, and the interpretability of the components, so the number of variables you should use. So in other words, or in mathematical words, you should try to achieve some sparseness. And this is why we try to find a new way for sparse PCA. PCA has also some application in image processing and so on, where the sparsity would be an obvious advantage. So there are 3 different ways to express an optimization problem when you try to find a sparse minimizer. So there is the weighted form, the constraint form, and the function constraint form. I guess you are more or less familiar with all these forms, and you can try to adapt these forms for PCA. So the classic PCA problem is the following. You try to maximize the variance of the new variables while keeping the loadings orthonormal. And so we can adapt it for the 3 forms. So this leads to this for the weighted form, this for the L2 constraint form, and this form for the function constraint form. So the first 2 forms, so the weighted form and L1 norm constraint form, have already been analyzed in many papers and have led to many efficient methods for sparse PCA. However, all these methods have one drawback in that they produce correlated components or non-orthogonal loadings, or both, mainly. So in this work, we try to use the function constraint form, which, as far as we know, has not been applied before for the sparse PCA problem, to find a new sparse PCA algorithm that could, in some way, try to manage both the orthogonality of the loading and the correlation, the uncorrelation of the components. So, in practice, this is the function that we found have some interesting properties, because this is an optimization on the oblique manifold. So yeah, we define the oblique manifold as the manifold with columns of each norm, where the columns of each, the norm of each column is equal to 1. And so we try to find the loadings, so on the oblique manifolds, that minimize this cost function. With this term is the sparsity term, and the other term is the term that makes sparse PCA as close to PCA as possible. And so mu is a parameter that defines the trade-off between the 2 terms. So in order to solve this, so to optimize this function, we have to make the problem smooth. So we express the L1 norm of A like this, which is a well-known method, so I forgot the name, but to optimize, so to make the L1 norm smooth, where epsilon is kept as small as possible. And in this formulation, it turns out that at the minimum, well, it can be shown that if this approximates D, then A transpose A is close to orthonormal. Yes, sorry, I forgot to say that D is a diagonal matrix with the eigenvalues of it, with the eigenvalues of the initial correlation matrix on its diagonal. And so this is an interesting property, because this means that if we, at the minimum, the new components are close to orthogonal, and the loadings are, the components are close to uncorrelated, while the loadings are close to orthonormal. And so with this approximation, the final cost function becomes this. And we solve this cost function with MANOPT, which is, so Nicola talked about it, a MATLAB toolbox for optimization on manifolds. This is our final cost function. So for the tests that have been performed, we used a real DNA methylation dataset, which is available on online on the NCBA website. In order to speed up the computations, we selected randomly 2,000 genes, and we have 150 samples, more or less. We did the test with 10 components, and we are mainly interested in 3 different measures. That is, the variance explained by the new variables, so the components, the correlation between the components, and the orthogonality of the loadings. Of course, for sparse PCA problem, all these measures have to be analyzed in regards to the sparseness that is achieved. And we compared the results with the method of Journey, which is a quite well-known method for sparse PCA problem. And the method of Journey can be both run with the L0 or L1 norm, so we did the test with both. So first, a drawback of our method is that it does not produce exactly 0 values. So many values are reduced to close to 0, but not exactly 0. So you have to impose some kind of threshold for which below this threshold you put the value to 0. And of course we did this before plotting the graph. So first, not the more interesting, but still useful, to see the sparseness that can be achieved in regards to the parameter mu. So just to remember you, the parameter mu determines the trade-off between the sparsity and the variance explained, so that the larger the mu parameter, the closer you will be to the initial classic PCA problem. And so we can see that typically we will try to have some high value of sparsity, but we can see that we can achieve this kind of value with some reasonable value of mu. And all the curves are presented for 3 different values, so 3 different threshold values, so below which we put all the values to 0. First, about the variance explained. So I first did the mistake to compute the variance as in standard PCA problem, that is like this. So this is the variance of the new, the data in the new space of the components. And by analyzing the results, I was quite disappointed to see that our method is quite, the Journey's method performed much better than ours in many different sparseness. So the 2 blue are Journey's method for the L0 and L1 norm, while the 3 other colors are our method for different threshold values. And you can see that there is, quite a large difference in the variance explained between the 2 methods. However, we realized that this method to compute the variance was not adapted for sparse PCA problem, because this is the method used for standard PCA, and this is adapted when there is no correlation between the components. But when you have some kind of correlation between the components, some variance is computed and in many components, and so it's taken into account in many components. So you have to take the correlation between the components into account before plotting the variance. And so if you analyze the correlation between the components, you can see that Journe's methods produce much more correlated components than our method. And so you can guess that in this graph, the variance explained by Journe's methods is more over-optimist in regards to our method, since the components are more correlated in Journe's method. So yeah, the correlation was computed this way with a normalization term, and yeah, basically it takes all the term of the non-diagonal terms of the covariance matrix into account. And so we have to take care of, so to deal with this correlation between the components before computing the variance. And how can we do so? Well, a paper, well, a few years ago, already deal with this problem. So for classical PCA, when you have orthogonal loadings, well, actually, yeah, and so this is for uncorrelated components instead of orthogonal loadings. Well, you can compute the variance like this. But what if you have non-orthogonal loadings and correlated components? You have to take this correlation into account. And so the way basically you have to remove the variance that has already been explained by the previous components. So you have to project for component I, you have to project the component I on the first component from 1 to I minus 1 and remove the variance already explained by this component. And this can be done with the QR decomposition. So suppose you have your data in the new space, which are equal to x times a. If you perform the QR decomposition with Q is orthonormal and R is upper triangular, well, you can compute the variance, so the residual variance after adjustment has trace of R squared. And so this is how we compute the adapted variance. And with this measure, you can see that our method is much closer to Journe's method. Still a bit less good, but there is not a large difference as there was in the previous graph. And this is because, yeah, the variance computed before for Journe's method was more over-optimistic than for our method, since the components were more correlated. And so you can see that we have good variance explained. We have much more uncorrelated components than Journe's method. So what about the last measure of interest, so the orthogonality? Well, for many values of sparseness, we have much more non-orthogonal components. So this is a measure of like non-orthogonality. Again, it was normalized. And you can see that our method can make all the loadings stay quite reasonably non-orthogonal. While for Journe's methods, it quite really depends on the value of sparseness that you use. And so, in conclusion, the sparseness is more and more needed as we collect larger and larger data sets. And you need the sparseness so you can interpret the results. This is why we focus on Sparse PCA method. And this method, compared to other methods, and more specifically Journey's method, can still explain a large part of variance, well, a bit less than Journey's method, but it still fits quite reasonably well. And it outperforms Journey's method both for the uncorrelation between the new components and for the orthogonality of the loadings, which can be two very desirable properties. So as a further work, we need to make some tests at larger scales and compare with other methods, as there exist quite a few for Sparse PCA methods. Okay, thank you.